The moment Serena heard the Alpha's voice echo through the ceremonial hall, she knew something was wrong. Not the quiet, subtle wrongness that had been her constant companion for years, the kind that whispered in the back of her mind during sleepless nights and long silences, but a sharp, bone-deep wrongness that arrived like a blade drawn across skin. The solstice ceremony was the most sacred gathering of the Ashvale Pack, held once a year beneath the ancient stone archway that their ancestors had carved from living granite 400 years ago, and every member of the pack had come dressed in their finest. The torches burned gold and amber against the night sky. The air smelled of pine resin and ceremonial oils. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to see better, and Serena stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, with her hands pressed flat against the swell of her belly, feeling the 5 lives inside her shift and settle as though they too sensed the electricity that had begun to crackle through the space between her and the man she had loved in silence for 3 years. Serena Voss. Alpha Dorian Ashvale's voice carried across the entire courtyard without effort. He had that kind of voice, the kind that filled rooms and silenced conversations, and made lesser wolves instinctively lower their eyes. He was standing on the raised stone dais at the center of the ceremonial circle, broad-shouldered and sharp-jawed, and dressed in the deep green ceremonial coat that she had always thought made him look like something carved from the forest itself. He was looking at her, not with warmth, not with the quiet acknowledgement she had told herself she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes when no one else was watching. He was looking at her the way one looks at a problem that has finally been placed in front of them and must be dealt with before it grows inconvenient. Come forward. She moved through the crowd, because her feet obeyed before her mind could form a reason to hesitate. The wolves around her parted, and she felt their eyes on her, felt the shift in the air as they registered her condition, the visible swell of her pregnancy that she had managed to conceal beneath loose clothing for as long as she could, but could no longer hide. She was 7 months along, 5 heartbeats that the pack healer had confirmed with wide eyes and a hushed voice. 5. The healer had told her it was extraordinary, that quintuplets among their kind had not been recorded in living memory, that such a birth was considered a sign of profound supernatural significance. Serena had held that information close to her chest like a secret gift, waiting for the right moment to share it with Dorian, believing that it would matter to him, that it would change something in the careful distance he maintained between them. She had been wrong. She understood that now, standing before him with the entire pack watching, feeling the cold settle into her bones despite the warmth of the torches. "You carry children you have not declared to this pack," Dorian said. His voice was completely level. There was no anger in it, no accusation. And somehow that was worse than fury would have been. "You have concealed this from your alpha and from your community for months." "I was going to tell you," Serena said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Tonight. I was going to tell you tonight, after the ceremony. 7 months, Serena." He looked at her for one long moment, and she searched his face desperately for something, anything, that resembled the man she had believed him to be. And the father? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripples move through the crowd. She saw the way several wolves near her shifted their weight, suddenly uncomfortable, suddenly wanting to be anywhere but witness to whatever was about to happen. "You know who the father is," she said quietly. "I know what you have told me," he replied. And there was something in his tone then, something careful and deliberate, something that felt rehearsed. "What I know for certain is that no official bond exists between us. No claiming, no documentation. And 5 children of unknown lineage are not something this pack can absorb without verification and process." He paused. The pause felt like the moment before a sentence is handed down. "Therefore, by the authority of the Alpha of Ashvale Pack, and in accordance with our ancestral laws regarding undeclared offspring and unverified lineage, I am declaring your children outside pack recognition until such time as independent verification can be established." He paused again, and when he spoke next his voice dropped just slightly, just enough that she knew the next part was the part he had practiced most carefully. And given the circumstances, and given that you have demonstrated a pattern of concealment that calls your loyalty to this pack into question, I am also invoking the right of exile. Exile. The word fell through the ceremonial hall like something ancient and terrible. She heard someone in the crowd draw a sharp breath. She heard a child ask a parent what that meant, and the parent shushed them quickly. Serena stood very still. The 5 lives inside her moved, a slow, rolling shift as though they were rearranging themselves, settling deeper, as though they too understood that the ground beneath their mother had just shifted irreparably. "You are exiling me," she said. Not a question. She needed to hear herself say it, so that it would become real. "You have 3 hours to collect your belongings and leave Ashvale territory," Dorian said. "Pack resources will not follow you. Pack protection will not follow you. You leave as you came, as an individual, without claim." He looked at her for one more moment, and she thought, for just a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Something that might have been discomfort or guilt, or the ghost of something that had once been warmer. Then he looked away. He looked past her as though she had already ceased to exist. The ceremony will continue. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. She did not cry in the courtyard. She made herself understand that immediately, made it a rule, a wall, a decision so firm it became architecture inside her chest. She would not give them her tears. She moved back. Through the crowd, and the wolves parted for her again, but differently this time, with the particular uncomfortable distance that people maintain from someone who has been publicly declared untouchable. Some of them would not meet her eyes. One woman, someone Serena had shared meals with for 2 years, someone she had considered a friend, turned her face deliberately toward the dais as Serena passed, as though the act of witnessing was itself dangerous. Serena noted this. She filed it away in the same careful internal space where she had been filing similar small cruelties for years, and she kept walking. Her quarters in the pack compound were small, but she had made them her own over the years, filling shelves with the books she loved, and the small carved figures she had collected from the markets, and the dried flowers she pressed between pages, because they were beautiful, and because beauty felt important in ways she could not always articulate. She took what she could carry. She took the warmest clothing she owned, and the small emergency funds she had saved, and a photograph of her mother, who had died when Serena was 12, who had always told her that her quiet was not weakness, but depth. She stood in the middle of the small room for one long moment, and let herself feel the weight of what was happening. Then she picked up her bag, and she left. The forest beyond Ashvale territory was cold and dark, and indifferent in the particular way that wilderness is indifferent. Not cruel, but simply unconcerned, continuing its ancient business of growing and decaying and renewing, regardless of what small human dramas played out at its edges. Serena walked for 2 hours before she had to stop. The cold had gotten into her joints, and her back ached with the low, persistent ache that had become her constant companion in the last month of pregnancy, and she was breathing harder than she should have been. She found a rocky outcropping that offered some shelter from the wind, and she sat down against it, and let herself rest, and let herself, finally, feel the full weight of what Dorian Ashvale had done to her. She pressed her hands against her belly, and she thought about 5 heartbeats, 5 small lives that had done nothing except exist, that had been declared without recognition, before they had even drawn their first breath. And the tears came then, quietly, without drama, the kind of crying that is less about grief, and more about the body's need to release. Pressure before it builds to something unsustainable. She did not know how long she sat there. The moon had moved when she became aware that she was not alone. She had not heard footsteps or sensed approach the way she normally would have, which told her that whoever was nearby was either extraordinarily skilled at concealment, or had been there longer than she realized, and had simply chosen to make themselves known now. She rose from the ground, with the careful deliberateness of a woman in her third trimester, pressing one hand against the rock for support, and turned to face the tree line. The man who stood at the edge of the trees was not what she expected. She had expected with the particular paranoia of a newly exiled wolf in unfamiliar territory. Something threatening. Instead, she found someone who looked as though he had been standing in that exact spot for some time, with the patience of someone who had all night and no particular interest in rushing. He was tall, significantly taller than Dorian, with the kind of build that spoke of functional strength rather than performed dominance. His coat was dark and practical and expensive in the understated way that genuinely expensive things often are. He had dark hair and a face that was more compelling than conventionally handsome, all strong angles and careful stillness, the kind of face that made you feel like every expression it chose to display had been deliberately selected. His eyes were amber in the moonlight, and they were watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, which unsettled her because she had always been good at reading people. "You have been sitting against that rock for 40 minutes, he said. His voice was low and even, and carried no particular urgency. "The temperature is dropping. You should not be outside." "I do not have a great many alternatives at the moment," Serena said, and she was proud of how steady her voice remained. He looked at her for a moment, and she felt something then, something she had no framework for, a warmth that seemed to emanate from the space between them rather than from any external source, a pull that reminded her distantly of the descriptions she had read in old pack texts about mate bonds. But those were stories. Those were ancient mythology. Those were the kinds of things that happened in legends and not to women sitting against rocks in cold forests after being publicly humiliated and expelled from their entire lives. She dismissed the sensation and kept her eyes on the stranger. "Who are you?" she asked. "Kian Draveth," he said. He said it the way people say their name when they are accustomed to the name carrying weight, and are genuinely uncertain how to deliver it without that weight becoming the entire conversation. He paused, watching her face. "I see you do not recognize it." "Should I?" "Most people do," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. Something that suggested he found her lack of recognition more interesting than its absence was inconvenient. "I am the Alpha King." The Alpha King. The phrase moved through her mind and settled there with the particular density of things that are simultaneously unbelievable and, once spoken, entirely plausible. The Alpha King was not a figure from legend the way some supernatural rulers were. He was real, documented, the governing authority over every pack on the continent, a position that had existed for 3 centuries and was maintained through a combination of ancient compact, genuine power, and the kind of political acumen that kept fractious supernatural communities from tearing themselves apart. He was also, by every account she had ever encountered, a man who stayed within his palace and his council chambers and his formal diplomatic engagements, and absolutely did not stand in cold forests at midnight watching exiled Omegas recover from crying. "Why are you here?" she asked. "I was traveling through this region," he said, which she immediately understood was either a half-truth or a deliberate understatement. "I heard the ceremony. I heard the declaration." He paused. "I heard your name." Something about the way he said that last part, the slight change in inflection, the fractional pause before the word, "your," made her press her hand against her belly without thinking. The 5 lives inside her shifted in response, and she saw his eyes drop to her hands, and then rise back to her face with an expression that she still could not fully categorize, but that contained something she was not prepared for. Something that looked like recognition. "What do you want?" she asked, because she was tired and cold, and her back hurt, and she did not have the resources for anything other than directness. "I want you to come somewhere warmer," he said. "I want you to eat something, and rest somewhere that is not a rocky outcropping in declining temperatures. And then, when you are ready, I want to understand what happened tonight." He looked at her steadily. "I am not offering you anything other than immediate safety. I am not asking anything of you. I am simply telling you that there is a warm vehicle 20 minutes from here, and that you and your children are welcome in it." Serena looked at him for a long time. She was good at reading people, and she could not read him fully. But what she could read did not frighten her. What she could read felt, in some fundamental way that she could not explain and did not trust, like safety. She was also cold and exhausted and carrying 5 children, and had been awake for 19 hours, and had just had her entire life dismantled in front of an audience. "All right," she said. He moved to her side immediately, and she felt the warmth of him before he was close enough to touch. A radiating heat that seemed disproportionate to the cold. And when he offered his arm to help her navigate the uneven ground she took, it because she was practical enough to accept help when help was needed. He matched his pace to hers without comment, and they walked through the dark forest together, and the 5 lives inside her were still and calm in a way they had not been all evening. The vehicle was a large, dark SUV with 2 stone-faced individuals in the front who acknowledged Xian's return with the professional non-reaction of people trained to be witnesses and not participants. Xian helped her into the back with a careful attentiveness that was entirely practical and somehow also deeply personal, and he sat beside her, and the vehicle moved, and Serena watched the dark trees of Ashvale territory disappear behind her, and felt something close and compress in her chest that she recognized as grief, and also, underneath the grief, something else. Something she would not name yet. Something that felt like the first fragile breath of possibility. They traveled for 3 hours before the vehicle turned through. Gates that Serena saw briefly in the wash of headlights. Massive iron gates with the Draveth crest worked into their center. A wolf in full run beneath a crown of stars. And beyond the gates, the palace rose against the night sky, like something from a world she had never expected to inhabit. It was not the cold, forbidding architecture of power that she might have imagined. It was immense, but it was also alive. Warm light spilling from dozens of windows. The stone facade weathered into something that felt ancient and inhabited, rather than purely imposing. "This is your home?" she said. And she meant it to come out as a simple question, but it came out slightly odd despite her intention. "It is," Xian said. He was watching her face with that same careful attention he had maintained since the forest, as though her reactions were information he was cataloging, but not yet ready to act on. "You will have your own suite. A healer will attend you tonight if you want one. You are not obligated to speak to anyone, including me, until you have rested." He paused. "You are not a prisoner here. You are not a guest in the political sense of the word. You are simply someone who needed somewhere safe to be tonight, and this is the safest place I have." She did not say what she was thinking, which was that no one had ever said anything quite like that to her before, with that particular combination of authority and complete absence of expectation. She said, "Thank you," instead, and he nodded, and looked away, and she turned back to the window and watched the palace come closer, and thought about 5 heartbeats, and the cost of things, and the strange, vertiginous feeling of a life in the process of becoming something entirely new. The suite they gave her was 3 rooms, which was more space than she had inhabited in years, decorated in warm golds and deep blues, with a fireplace already burning, and a bed that looked like it had been built by someone who took the concept of rest seriously. A woman named Petra, round-faced and efficient, and possessed of the particular gentle competence of someone who has spent a lifetime in practical care, arrived within minutes of Serena being shown to the room and introduced herself as the palace's chief healer with a warm handshake and an immediate, professional assessment of Serena's condition that managed to be thorough without feeling invasive. Petra confirmed that the 5 heartbeats were strong and that Serena herself was exhausted and mildly dehydrated but otherwise intact, and she prescribed rest and food and warmth with the confidence of someone whose prescriptions were non-negotiable. And Serena, sitting on the edge of the enormous bed while Petra completed her examination, felt something inside her begin to unknot. It was not happiness. It was too early for happiness. It was simply the loosening of an internal bracing that she had been maintaining for so long she had forgotten it was there. She ate alone in her room, a meal that appeared as if conjured, rich and warm, and more than she could finish. She sat in the chair by the fire and ate slowly, and let the warmth seep into her joints. and she thought about Dorian Ashvale standing on his stone dais, declaring her unfit, and she thought about the woman who had turned her face away, and she thought about 3 years of careful invisibility that had nonetheless somehow failed to be invisible enough. And then she put those thoughts in the same careful, internal space where she had always put difficult things, and she went to bed, and she slept, deeply and dreamlessly, for the first time in months. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. She woke to sunlight pouring through windows she had forgotten to close, and the sensation of 5 small lives moving inside her, with the enthusiastic energy of beings who had decided that morning was an excellent time to be awake. She lay still for a moment and let herself simply exist in the unfamiliar luxury of space and warmth and quiet. And then she got up and washed and dressed in the fresh clothing that had appeared sometime during the night, folded neatly on the chair near the fire, in her size, which told her that someone had paid attention. She was standing at the window looking out over the palace grounds, which in daylight revealed themselves to be extraordinary, rolling green with formal gardens in the near distance and dense woodland beyond. When someone knocked at the door, she expected Petra. She did not expect Kian Draveth, standing in her doorway in what appeared to be his equivalent of casual clothing, a dark shirt and trousers that were still somehow impeccably fitted, holding 2 cups of something that steamed. "Herbal," he said when she looked at the cups. Petra approved it specifically. She stepped back from the door. He came in and set 1 cup on the table near the window, and then stood at a distance that was respectful and deliberate. And she picked up the cup and felt the warmth of it in her hands, and thought about the fact that the Alpha King of the entire continent was standing in her room, having apparently consulted with his healer about which beverages were safe for her pregnancy. "You did not have to do this," she said. "No," he agreed. "You did not have to bring me here at all." "No," he agreed again. He looked at her steadily. "But here we are. Here we are." She turned the phrase over in her mind and felt the warmth inside it, the acknowledgement of reality without agenda. And she looked at him, really looked at him in the morning light with the defensiveness of the previous night, slightly dimmed by sleep and warmth. And she noticed things she had not allowed herself to notice before. The steadiness of his eyes, the way he held his stillness, not as a performance of control but as a genuine default state, as though the world did not rush him, and he extended the same courtesy to everything around him. The faint shadow of something in his expression when he looked at her that she still could not name, and that she was beginning to suspect she needed to name soon before it named itself. "I need to understand what happened last night," she said. "Not to explain myself to you. I need to understand it for myself." "Then talk," he said. "I will listen." She talked. She had not intended to say as much as she did, but there was something about him that made editing feel like a waste of energy, something in the quality of his attention that was genuinely receiving rather than simply waiting for its turn to respond, and she found herself telling him things she had not said aloud to anyone. About the 3 years with Dorian Ashvale that had been not a relationship, but a sustained ambiguity, a series of moments that had felt significant, and then been allowed to dissolve without acknowledgement, a pattern of closeness and retreat that she had interpreted as caution, and that she now understood had been something else entirely. About the pregnancy, discovered 5 months in, and the hope she had allowed herself, the careful construction of a future she had built on sand. About the pack healer's wonder at the quintuplets. About 7 months of holding a secret that had felt like treasure and had turned out to be a target. Kian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the same gardens she had been admiring before he arrived. "The children," he said finally. "The healer here examined you last night. With your permission, I would like her to perform a more thorough assessment today." "Why?" He turned to look at her, and there was something deliberate in his expression now, something that had moved past the careful neutrality of the previous hours into something more specific. "Because quintuplet births in our kind have not occurred in 3 centuries, he said. "And the last time they occurred, it was within a bloodline that was thought to have ended." He paused. The Voss bloodline. The name of her own family coming from his mouth in that context felt like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. She set down the cup slowly. My father was low-ranking. My mother was an Omega without pack status. We were not anyone's ancient bloodline. Your mother's surname before she married, Cian said. What was it? Serena opened her mouth and then closed it. She thought about her mother, who had died when Serena was 12, who had spoken little of her own family, who had sometimes looked at Serena with an expression that felt like both pride and sorrow simultaneously, who had told her once, late at night, when Serena was sick with fever, and her mother had sat beside her bed through the night, that Serena carried something in her that would one day be too large to contain, and that when that day came, she should not be afraid. Ethan, she said finally. Her name was Mira Ethan. Expression that moved across Kian's face, then was brief and controlled, but unmistakable. Recognition, and beneath it something larger, something that looked like the settling of a long-held calculation. Ethan, he said quietly. Then we have considerably more to discuss than I realized. The discussion that followed, in a formal sitting room with Petra present and maps and documents spread across a table, lasted 3 hours and rearranged Serena's understanding of her own life with the thoroughness of someone taking apart a watch and rebuilding it in a different configuration. The Ethan line, Cian explained, with the particular care of someone conveying information he has decided the recipient deserves fully and completely, was one of the 5 founding bloodlines of the Continental Werewolf Compact, lines so ancient and powerful that they had been the source of the first Alpha Kings 3 centuries ago. The Ethan line had been thought extinct after a series of events that the historical record described as a plague, but that the royal archives, to which Cian had access, described as something considerably more deliberate. Political erasure, the systematic destruction of a bloodline by those who feared what it represented. One survivor, female, had escaped. She had hidden. She had taken a simple surname and married a low-ranking wolf and raised a daughter in the deepest possible obscurity. And that daughter had raised a daughter. My mother knew, Serena said when Cian paused in his account. She was not asking. She was assembling pieces. She would have known enough, he said. Whether she knew the full scope is impossible to say, but she would have understood that her line was significant and dangerous to carry, and she would have made choices accordingly. She protected me by making me invisible, Serena said, and the ache of that understanding was complicated and profound. Grief and gratitude tangled together around the memory of her mother's steady, quiet love. She kept me safe by making sure no one would look at me twice. She paused. And Dorian Ashvale. Dorian Ashvale's family has significant political interests, Cian said carefully. I would not make accusations without evidence, but I will tell you that his decision last night, the speed of it, the preparation that the public declaration suggests, does not read to me as a spontaneous response to discovering a pregnancy. He knew, Serena said. The coldness of it settled through. Her not as fresh pain, but as clarification. The bitterness of understanding replacing the rawness of shock. He knew what I was, or suspected, and he wanted to eliminate the complication before it became visible. That is my reading, Cian said. He was watching her with the same careful, full attention he had maintained since the forest. And she met his gaze and held it, and felt the warmth between them pulse again. Stronger in the daylight, impossible to dismiss as tiredness or stress, or the strange electricity of a difficult night. It was real. It was present. It was doing something to her breathing that she was choosing for the moment not to examine. I want to be honest with you about something, he said. And I want you to take the time you need with what I am about to say, because I am not saying it to create any pressure or expectation. I am saying it because I think you deserve accurate information about your situation. She waited. You are my mate, he said. Simply. Directly. The way he said everything. I knew it in the forest last night. I know it now. The bond is present and it is real, and I have been in this position long enough to be certain about what I am experiencing." He paused. "I am also aware that you have just been through something that has significantly damaged your capacity to trust. And I am aware that you are carrying 5 children who are your first priority. And I am aware that the last thing you need from me right now is the weight of a bond that you did not choose and have not had time to process. So I am telling you this as information, not as a claim. You are not obligated to feel anything, do anything, or be anything other than exactly who you are and wherever you are in your own process. I will be here. I have no interest in rushing you." The silence that followed was one of the most remarkable silences Serena had ever inhabited. It was not uncomfortable. It was full of something, warm and weighted and patient, and she sat with it and with everything it contained, and thought about the fact that this man, this stranger, who was simultaneously not a stranger in any way that felt fundamental, had just offered her the most honest and spacious declaration she had ever received. She thought about mate bonds, which she had always believed in despite everything, believed in the way one believes in gravity, as a fact of the world that does not require personal experience to confirm. She thought about the warmth between them, and the way her 5 lives had gone calm when he was near. She thought about her mother's quiet, patient love, and the way it had shaped her own understanding of what genuine care looked like. "I hear you," she said finally, "and I appreciate the honesty more than I can say." She paused. "I am going to need time." "I know," he said. "You have all of it." The weeks that followed were unlike anything in Serena's experience, which had been characterized by smallness, by the deliberate miniaturization of her own needs and desires in service of invisibility. Life in the Draveth Palace was not small. It was vast and warm, and full of people who moved through it with purpose, and Serena, given the freedom to exist within it at whatever pace suited her, found herself gradually expanding into the space, reclaiming dimensions of herself she had not known she had compressed. Petra became a constant and reassuring presence, monitoring her pregnancy with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that what she was watching was extraordinary. The 5 heartbeats grew stronger daily. They responded to music, Serena discovered, and to the deep timbre of Cian's voice, and to the particular quality of the late afternoon light in the eastern gardens, where she took to walking in the hours before dinner. Cian himself maintained the exact distance he had promised, present but undemanding, occasionally appearing at the edges of her days with the comfortable naturalness of someone who has found a sustainable rhythm and is content to maintain it. He ate dinner with her sometimes, when she wanted company, and they talked, genuinely talked, conversations that ranged from the political complexity of governing a continental supernatural community to the books they had each loved as children, to the particular quality of grief that comes from losing a parent too young. He was, she discovered gradually, and with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned to investigate rather than simply believe, exactly as straightforward as he appeared. There was no performance in him. What she saw was what he was, which was a man of significant power, who wore that power with the same ease he wore his practical, expensive clothing without display, without the need for others to register it, secure enough in its existence to have no particular interest in proving it. She noticed, too, the way the palace staff regarded him, not with the particular, careful deference of people managing a difficult employer, but with something warmer, something that spoke of genuine regard. She noticed the way he handled the diplomatic correspondence that arrived daily from pack councils across the continent, with patience and precision, and a lack of appetite for drama that she found increasingly remarkable, given how much drama seemed to arrive at his door. And she noticed, though she was not yet ready to discuss it, the way her own wolf, which had been subdued and quiet for as long as she could remember, had begun to stir. Not dramatically. Not yet. But present, aware, as though something that had been sleeping had caught a scent and was beginning to lift its head. The days established themselves into a rhythm she had not expected to find comforting. She woke early, as she had always done, and spent the first hour of the morning in the quiet of her suite, with her hands pressed against the swell of her belly, talking to the 5 lives inside her in a voice barely above a whisper. She told them about the gardens she had discovered, She told them about the books in the palace library, which was 3 rooms long and smelled of old paper and cedar, and was tended by a slight, scholarly man named Felix, who found her presence there so delightful that he began leaving small stacks of books he thought she might enjoy on the reading table nearest the window. She told them about their father, though she did not call him that yet. Not aloud, though she was beginning to understand the word was inevitable. She told them that the world they were coming into was complicated, but that it was also, she was increasingly certain, a world that intended to do right by them. Cian gave her the library access on her 3rd day without being asked, simply mentioned it during one of their morning tea conversations with the casualness of someone arranging a thing that was obvious, and she had spent 3 full hours there that afternoon and come to dinner with ink on her fingers, and more animation in her face than she had felt in months. And he had looked at her across the table with something warm and quiet, and she had caught it and held his gaze for a moment longer than was necessary, and then looked down at her plate and felt something very small and very new unfurl in her chest. She did not examine it directly. She let it exist the way you let a flame exist, nearby, acknowledged, neither denied nor grasped. The political dimension of her situation became clearer to her over those weeks, not because Cian pressed it on her, but because she was observant and had always been better at understanding systems than she was given credit for. She understood that her presence in the palace was already generating questions in the broader supernatural community, that the Alpha King housing a recently exiled pregnant Omega was not a neutral act regardless of what explanation was offered, and that the questions would intensify rather than diminish as time passed, and as the nature of the mate bond between them became something that was increasingly difficult to explain as simple hospitality. She understood that Vivian Alcott was not the only political figure with an opinion about Cian's personal circumstances, simply the most proximate. She understood that the Asheville Pact's decision to exile her, particularly given what was now known about her bloodline, was going to have consequences that would eventually require formal response. She held all of this in her mind, and she did not feel overwhelmed by it, which surprised her, and she spent some time understanding why before concluding that the difference was simply this. For the first time in her adult life, she was not navigating complexity alone. She said as much to Cian one evening when they had walked together in the gardens after dinner, which had become a habit neither of them had proposed directly, but which had simply begun and continued with the comfortable inevitability of things that fit correctly. She said, "I am not accustomed to the feeling that there is someone beside me in the managing of difficult things." She said it matter-of-factly, looking at the path ahead rather than at him, and she felt him consider the statement with the same care he brought to everything she said. "I am accustomed to being the person who manages difficult things quietly, alone, and then presents the resolution as though it required no effort," she continued. "I developed that as a survival skill. I am beginning to understand it was also a kind of loneliness." "Yes," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I know that particular loneliness." She looked at him then. He was looking at the garden, at the way the last of the light was moving through the leaves, and she saw in his profile the same quality she had been cataloging in her careful internal way for weeks. The fundamental solitude of someone who has been positioned at the center of everything, and consequently belongs fully to nothing, who is responsible for everything and vulnerable to no one, who has built an extraordinary life and inhabits it with complete competence and genuine dedication and a private hunger for something that competence and dedication cannot provide. She understood him, she realized. Not fully, not yet, but in the way that matters, in the way that recognizes its own reflection. "You are also not accustomed to it," she said. He turned to look at her, and the amber of his eyes in the fading light was very warm. "No," he said, "but I find I'm learning quickly." There was a night in her 4th week, past midnight, when she could not sleep and had come to the library to read, and had found him already there. He had looked up from his correspondence without particular surprise, as though her presence in his library at 2 a.m. was entirely unremarkable, and gestured to the chair by the fire with the ease of long familiarity, and she had settled into it and opened her book, and they had sat together in companionable silence for 2 hours, not talking, simply occupying the same warm space. And that had been, she thought afterward, the moment she had stopped arguing with herself about what was happening between them, and simply let it be what it was. Not because the mate bond had overwhelmed her capacity for choice. It had not. She understood, with the clarity that comes from having made very bad choices about where to place trust, that the bond was real and permanent, but that what she was choosing was something different, something that existed alongside the bond, rather than being explained by it. She was choosing him, the man, the particular specific person who brought her herbal tea, approved by the healer, and sat with her in silence at 2 a.m. and told her, directly and without agenda, the truth about who she was. It was in her 6th week at the palace that Vivian Alcott arrived. Serena had heard the name before her arrival, mentioned in passing by various staff members with the particular careful neutrality that indicated complicated feelings being professionally managed. Vivian was the head of the Continental Pack Council's diplomatic division, a position of considerable power, and she was also, as became apparent within approximately 15 minutes of her entering the palace, someone who had cultivated a specific relationship with Kian Draveth over many years, and had very clear ideas about what that relationship should eventually become. She was extraordinary to look at, in the way that certain people are extraordinary, not through conventional beauty alone, but through the projection of absolute certainty in their own importance. She had pale gold hair and green eyes, and a way of moving through spaces as though she had prearranged every room to suit her. She embraced Kian upon arrival with the easy familiarity of long association, and she looked at Serena, standing in the corridor with her considerable pregnancy and her borrowed palace clothing, with an expression that was perfectly polite and entirely without warmth. "The Omega from Ashvale," Vivian said, as though reading from a file. "Kian mentioned he had offered you shelter. How kind of him." She smiled. The smile was technically correct in every particular, and conveyed absolutely nothing. "You must be so grateful." "I am," Serena said pleasantly. She had encountered people like Vivian before, not at this scale, not with this degree of polish, but the fundamental architecture was familiar. She matched the pleasantness exactly, and did not expand upon it, and she saw in the fractional narrowing of Vivian's green eyes that this response had not been what was expected. Over the days that followed, Vivian's presence in the palace was a constant, careful pressure. She was never overtly hostile. She was too skilled for that. Instead, she was solicitous in a way that consistently underscored Serena's position as a temporary guest, a charity case, someone whose connection to this world was borrowed and fragile. She mentioned, in Serena's hearing, the importance of Kian's position requiring a mate of political standing. She praised Serena's resilience with an inflection that categorized resilience as the particular virtue of people who have had to endure a great deal of difficulty, not the people who made the decisions that caused the difficulty. She asked, with every appearance of genuine curiosity, about Serena's plans for after the birth, as though Serena's presence was obviously temporary, and it was simply a matter of scheduling. Cian observed all of this, and said nothing publicly, but Serena caught him watching Vivian sometimes with an expression that was not warmth. That was in fact the deliberate absence of warmth in someone who was choosing not to display the full extent of their feeling about something. Serena did not discuss Vivian with Kian directly. She was not in that place yet. She processed the situation with the same careful internal methodology she had always used, noting facts, identifying patterns, distinguishing between what she knew and what she feared, and what she simply did not yet have enough information to assess. What she knew was that Vivian represented a certain kind of calculation about Cian's future. What she feared was that the calculation had merit. What she did not yet know was what Cian himself wanted, truly wanted, beyond the mate bond that he had declared with such honest simplicity, and that she was becoming less able to dismiss as the days passed, and the warmth between them grew more persistent, and the 5 lives inside her continued their enthusiastic existence. The revelation came not from conversation but from crisis. She was 35 weeks along, alone in the eastern gardens in the early evening, when the first contraction hit. It was sharper and more sudden than anything Petra had prepared her for. And then there was a second one, and a third, and something else. Something that was not physical pain, but a kind of pressure behind her eyes and in her sternum, like a door being opened in a room she had not known was part of her internal architecture. She pressed her hands against the garden wall and breathed and felt the 5 lives inside her moving with focused urgency, as though they had decided collectively that this was the moment. And then, her wolf surfaced. Not gradually, not gently, in a wave that moved, through her from the inside out, warmth and silver light, and a howl that she contained with the last of her normal self-regulation before it escaped into the evening air. Kian was there in 4 minutes, which she later learned meant he had been running. He came through the garden gate and found her against the wall with silver light literally visible beneath her skin, faint but unmistakable. And he stopped. And for the first time since she had known him, she saw something other than measured calm in his face. He looked at her with something wide open and unguarded, and she understood in that moment that whatever she had been telling herself about the distance between them, whatever careful narrative she had been constructing about time and process and the importance of not trusting too quickly, was a story she had been telling herself to feel safe rather than a description of what was actually happening. "I need Petra," she said, which was practical and true, and also allowed her to not say the other thing, the enormous thing, the thing that was pulsing between them like a second heartbeat. "Already coming," he said. He crossed the space between them, and she reached for him without making a decision to do so, took his hand with both of hers, and the warmth that moved through the contact was overwhelming. Silver light brightening visibly beneath her skin, and he made a sound low in his throat that was not quite human, and was not quite wolf, and was entirely an involuntary response to the mate bond snapping into full presence between them. "I have you," he said. "Serena, I have you." The births took 11 hours, and they were attended by every healer in the palace and by Kian, who sat beside her through the entirety of it without leaving, without being asked to leave, without needing to be invited, simply present in the particular way that he had been present for every difficult thing since the night in the forest. The 5 children arrived in the order they had. Apparently decided upon internally, 3 girls and 2 boys, all healthy and all, as Petra confirmed with wide eyes, and a voice that was not quite steady, possessed of aura signatures that were extraordinary. Each child was distinct and complete, and each one, when placed in Serena's arms, looked at her with the focused attention of beings who had already made their assessment of the world and found her to be its center. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Kian looked at the 5 of them with an expression that Serena would remember for the rest of her life, something that moved through his careful, composed face like weather, a kind of wonder that he did not attempt to contain or manage. He looked at the children, and then he looked at her, and she looked back at him across the 5 small, miraculous presences between them. And the mate bond was not a warmth between them anymore. It was a fact. It was the most fundamental fact in the room. "I am not asking for anything," he said quietly, and she heard the echo of that first declaration, the one he had made with such deliberate generosity, the one that had given her space and time and the extraordinary gift of not being rushed. "But I want you to know that I would like very much to be their father, if that is something you would accept. And I would like very much to spend the rest of my life learning to deserve the right to call you mine, if that is something you would someday be willing to consider." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 3 years of invisibility and the slow erasure of a life she had tried to build in the wrong soil. She thought about a cold forest and warm herbal tea approved by a healer and 3 hours of conversation that had rearranged her understanding of her own history. She thought about her mother, who had known something worth protecting and had protected it with her life. And she thought about 5 heartbeats that had arrived into the world as though they had always known they were important, which they were, which was a fact she was only now, fully and without qualification, beginning to believe about herself. "Yes," she said. To both things. She said it simply and directly, the way he said everything, without performance or qualification, or the careful management of her own exposure that had characterized her for as long as she could remember. Yes. The 3 weeks that followed were the quietest of Serena's adult life, and also somehow the fullest. She healed. The 5 children, whom they named together in long evening conversations while each baby slept in turn, were extraordinary in ways that revealed themselves gradually, a warmth in their touch that calmed distressed animals, a particular quality of attention that suggested awareness beyond their age, occasional flickers of silver light in their eyes when they were contentedly fed and held, that made Petra set down her instruments and simply watch with the expression of someone who is witnessing something they will describe to their grandchildren. The Ethon legacy was not dormant in the next generation. It was present and awake and apparently very decided about making itself known. Vivian Alcott made one more attempt. It came in the form of a formal diplomatic communication to the Continental Pack Council, which Vivian chaired, presenting a motion to investigate the presence at the Draveth Palace of an individual of unverified pack standing whose claimed bloodline had not been formally authenticated and whose mate bond claim to the Alpha King represented a potential political complication. The motion was thorough and carefully worded and designed to create institutional friction around Serena's position while maintaining full political deniability for its author. It arrived in Cian's council chamber, and he read it once and set it down, and looked at his senior advisor with an expression that his senior advisor, who had worked with him for 15 years, would later describe as the look he got right before something significant happened. "Schedule an authentication ceremony," Cian said. "Full Continental witness. 1 month from today." The authentication ceremony was held in the largest ceremonial chamber in the Draveth Palace, and invitations had been sent to representatives of every major pack on the continent, along with a sufficient number of historical scholars, bloodline archivists, and neutral witnesses to make the outcome undeniable regardless of how the result appeared. Serena stood in the center of the chamber in a dress the color of deep water, one that Cian had chosen with the same quiet care he brought to everything, and she held within her the knowledge of what she was, and the understanding of what her children were, and the certainty of the mate bond that existed between her and the man standing to her left. And she was not afraid. She had not been afraid, she realized. Since the night in the forest when she had taken his arm and walked through the dark trees toward the warmth waiting on the other side. She had been processing and healing and carefully, deliberately, rebuilding her understanding of what was possible, which was different from afraid. The archivists performed the verification. They laid out the documents and the ancestral records, and they compared them to the results of the bloodline analysis that had been performed with her consent, and the result was what Cian and Petra and the Draveth Palace's own historians had already known, and what Vivian Alcott had understood before she filed her motion, which was why she had filed it, hoping that institutional scrutiny would accomplish what a cold forest exile had not. Serena Ethon Voss was the direct lineal descendant of the founding Ethon bloodline, the last of a line that had been deliberately destroyed for political reasons, and her 5 children were legitimate heirs of that bloodline and of the Draveth line by mate bond and paternal acknowledgement. The senior archivist, a small elderly woman with the kind of face that has seen everything and remains capable of surprise, looked up from the documents and looked at Serena and then looked at the assembled representatives and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the silent chamber, "Authentication confirmed. The line of Ethon is restored." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a large group of people absorbing something that will require them to reorient significantly. Serena stood in the middle of it and felt the 5 lives in the rooms above her, safe and warm and attended, and she felt Cian's presence at her side, steady and certain as gravity, and she felt her own wolf, fully awake now, fully present, the silver light that had been flickering under her skin since the births, now a steady, warm glow that she no longer felt any need to contain. She thought about Dorian, Ashvale standing on his stone dais declaring her children without recognition, and she thought about the woman who had turned her face away, and she thought about her mother hiding a princess in plain sight for a lifetime, and she reached for Kian's hand and laced her fingers through his, and felt the mate bond pulse between them like a living thing, joyful and present, and entirely without qualification. The authenticated documents were presented to the full assembly, and the representatives from every major pack stood in a chamber that held centuries of political history and felt the weight of what had just been confirmed. And in the silence after the senior archivist's declaration, Serena heard something she had not heard in the entirety of the ceremonial hall before that moment. She heard a single person begin to applaud, slowly and deliberately, and then another, and then the sound spread through the chamber the way warmth spreads from a fire, gradually and then all at once. And she stood in the center of it with her back straight and her chin level, and felt the silver light beneath her skin respond to the sound like a living thing, brightening, settling, becoming finally and completely at home in its own existence. Kian squeezed her hand once, briefly, with the particular quality of someone conveying something precise and complete that requires no translation. She squeezed back. The reception that followed the authentication ceremony was the kind of political event that Serena had never imagined herself navigating, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she navigated naturally. PAC representatives approached her with a range of reactions, from the genuinely delighted to the carefully recalibrated, and she received each one with the steady warmth that had always been her actual nature, once she was no longer compressing herself small enough to be ignored. Several older representatives, those who had been alive long enough to remember the stories of the Ethan line as history rather than legend, looked at her with a recognition that moved her deeply, a recognition that said they saw in her the resolution of something they had not expected to see, resolved in their lifetimes. A woman from the Western Mountain Packs, ancient and severe, and possessed of the kind of eyes that see through most performances, held Serena's hand for a long moment and said simply, "Your mother would be proud." And Serena had to breathe very carefully for several seconds before she could respond. Vivienne Alcott's diplomatic motion was withdrawn the following day. Vivienne herself resigned from the Continental Pack Council chairmanship a week after that, citing a desire to pursue other opportunities, in language that everyone present for the authentication ceremony, understood as the particular formal phrasing of someone removing themselves from a situation they can no longer influence. Kian accepted her resignation with the same careful courtesy he extended to everything. He did not comment on it to Serena beyond a single observation delivered one evening over dinner while the babies were being settled for the night by their small army of devoted attendants. "She is skilled," he said. "She simply misunderstood what I wanted," which was, to be clear, never her. Dorian Ashvale's situation resolved itself with the particular thoroughness of things that have been accumulating consequences for some time. The Continental Pack Council, following the authentication ceremony, had questions for the Alpha of Ashvale Pack about the circumstances surrounding the exile of a direct descendant of a founding bloodline. Questions that turned out to have answers that implicated the Ashvale family in the historical suppression of the Ethon line in ways that went back 3 generations. The Ashvale Pack was placed under council oversight. Dorian Ashvale stepped down from the Alpha position. These events were not arranged by Kian or by Serena. They were simply the consequence of light being allowed into a space that had been deliberately kept dark for a very long time. The claiming ceremony, when it came, was nothing like the solstice ceremony at Ashvale, which was what Serena had thought about, obliquely and then directly, while planning it. It was smaller and more personal, held in the Eastern Gardens at sunset, attended only by people whose presence felt like warmth rather than weight. The 5 babies were there, held by the healers who had become their devoted additional family, and they watched the proceedings with the same focused attentiveness they brought to everything, as though they had been waiting for exactly this moment and were satisfied that it had arrived. Kian stood before Serena in the golden light and took her hands and looked at her with the full, open expression she had first seen in the maternity room, the one that contained everything he was without management or performance, and he said, in a voice that was steady and certain and entirely his own, "I choose you, Serena Ethan. I choose you with full knowledge of who you are and what you carry and where you come from. And I would choose you again in any circumstance in any world, in any life. You are my mate, and you are my queen, and you have been the missing piece of everything I have built, for longer than I understood it was missing. She looked at him, and thought about the girl who had pressed herself small for years, who had loved in invisible silence, who had been told in the most public possible way that she was not enough, and she thought about the woman who had walked out of a cold forest on the arm of a stranger who had turned out to be the truest thing she had ever found, and she thought about 5 small people sleeping in the rooms above them, who had arrived into the world already carrying the weight of an ancient legacy, and were already, at 3 weeks old, demonstrating that they intended to carry it with considerable enthusiasm. She looked at Cian, and she felt the mate bond between them, warm and real and patient as it had always been. And she said, clearly and with her whole voice, with no part of herself held back or managed or compressed, "I choose you, Cian Draveth. I choose you with everything I am and everything I am still becoming, and I am not afraid of either." The silver light came then, flowing outward from both of them with a warmth that the assembled witnesses would describe afterward with the particular eloquence of people who have witnessed something genuinely unprecedented. It was not dramatic. It was not frightening. It was simply real, and warm, and absolutely final. And when it settled, the claiming bond was complete, and the night had come, and the first stars were visible above the gardens, and the 5 babies were beginning to indicate that dinner was overdue, and Cian was laughing, actually laughing, a full and genuine sound that Serena realized she had never heard from him at full volume. And she was laughing too, and somewhere in the palace above them, 5 small heirs to an ancient and restored bloodline added their voices to the evening with the complete conviction of beings who have arrived exactly where they were meant to be. The weeks and months that followed were the architecture of a life that had always been possible and was now real. Serena learned to be a queen the way she learned everything, through careful attention and genuine curiosity, and the particular deep patience that had always been her truest gift, even when she had understood it as a limitation. The Continental Pack Council reorganized with new leadership that was younger and more progressive, and considerably less invested in the suppression of inconvenient bloodlines. The Draveth Palace filled with more sound and more movement, and more life than it had contained in years, because 5 children of combined Ethon and Draveth heritage turned out to be, as several of the more senior staff members observed with expressions ranging from delight to mild alarm, precisely as extraordinary as the prophecy had suggested. They were kind children and joyful children, and they had their mother's deep patience and their father's stillness, and a collective quantity of supernatural ability that their grandmother Mira, could she have witnessed it, would have recognized as the thing she had spent her life protecting until the world was ready for it to bloom. Serena thought about her mother often. She thought about the quiet, careful love that had been the container of her earliest years, the love that had worked through concealment and small, everyday protection, that had shaped Serena into someone capable of surviving exactly what she had survived and finding exactly what she had found. She thought about what her mother would have said, in the direct and warm way she had of saying things, seeing her daughter standing in the formal hall of the Draveth Palace with a crown that sat as naturally as if it had always been there, and a king beside her, and 5 remarkable small people ahead of her, who were already beginning to understand their own significance. She thought her mother would have said something simple and true. She thought she would have said, "This is what I was protecting. This is exactly what I always knew you were." If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?